I think the European Union has been a leader in climate policy. For example, it created the world's first CO2 cap and trade market. And currently, the European Union is also innovating with the carbon border adjustment mechanism, as well as expanding the EU ETS for fuels. Now, I view these as very good developments. However, that does not take away that we cannot be critical of EU climate policy. And my guest today, Luis Garicano, is someone who is both critical and constructive. And in January 2025, he wrote a blog post called 10 Principles for a New Climate Policy. And in this blog post, he suggested 10 principles to improve EU climate policy. Now, many of these principles sound very intuitive to economists. For example, we should use incentives and not mandates. Or a principle is that trade-offs are real. So those kind of sound intuitive to economists. So the kind of question then becomes, why is this not already happening? And what are the barriers? So I'm excited to have him on today to discuss his views, both to discuss what they are and how they might have evolved. And whether you agree with him or not, I think you can learn a lot from him because at the margin, climate policy can always be improved. So my guest is Luis Garicano, who has been both active in academics and policy, and I think this kind of makes him unique. He is currently a professor at the London School of Economics and one of Europe's leading economists on technology, organizations, and growth. He has held senior academics positions at both LSE and the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, and his research has been published in the top journals. And from 2019-2022, he also served as a member of the European Parliament, where he worked on major economic policy issues, including the European Recovery Fund and support for Ukraine. During this time, he also helped shape the carbon border adjustment mechanism. He holds degrees in economics law and European studies, as well as a master's and PhD in economics from the University of Chicago. So, Luis, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I am very excited to have you on. I really like your site and your blog posts. I think you always have very interesting things to say. So maybe just to start, why in January 2025 did you decide to write this blog post about these climate policies?
So it's kind of, been difficult to state the obvious in some sense. We've been kind of scared of breaking the consensus on climate or saying things that would maybe cause people to rethink. And so stuff that was obvious and that almost everybody who thinks hard about climate and economics kind of probably would share has gone away from the discourse. The idea, for example, basic idea of trade-offs, the idea that it's no free lunch, and fighting climate, global warming is a really key policy priority for the world and for the planet. But it's not going to come free. It's going to cost us. And instead, the way it has been sold is the Green Deal for jobs, and everything is win-win, and there's no sacrifices to make. Well, truth of the matter is, if you make the energy more expensive, then you have to pay more for energy, and that's going to cost you in many ways. So you see a tendency to minimize those costs or to even hide them and say they're all benefits. And the truth of the matter is all this green investment. We have a reference, for example. I mean, I remember perfectly well the Green Deal for jobs of Ursula von der Leyen on my first sessions in Parliament. That she was defending that the Green Deal would create more jobs. Olaf Scholz in March 23. He said green investment will help Germany achieve growth rates last seen in the 50s. Well, the truth of the matter is the post-war economic boom was based on huge investment. And here we're going to do investment to replace existing capacity, not to create a new capacity, like replacing boilers with heat pumps. So I wanted to kind of put all these things on the table and try to have a more honest debate about climate. I was scared of how people would react, because I'm clearly somebody who's been pushing some of this legislation and pressing for some of the legislation and arguing in favor of taking the climate goals very seriously. But I'm also somebody who wants to kind of be straight with citizens and say some of these things are going to cost, and we need to say it. I think EVs are the future, for sure. I mean, there's no question that EVs are the future, electric vehicles. But I don't know, and I don't think, to be more straightforward, that forbidding ICEs for everybody, internal combustion engines for everybody in 2035 is good policy. We can talk about that later.
Yeah. And I think it's worth emphasizing because, like you say, you put those principles out there. But I don't want to make this a session of like, all the things that could be improved because like you say, and also in the article, you're a huge proponent of the EU emission trading system. People on this podcast know this is my favorite topic because I think they're just brilliant. You have worked on carbon border adjustment mechanism. You also make it very clear climate change is happening. There's a real cost. So I want to put that forward, like you said, because maybe a fear of like the moment you say anything that goes against there's no cost, you might be pushed into a certain corner.
Agree. It's kind of the debate has been taking place in black and white, and either you are for or you're against. I wrote a paper with Adam Brzezinski, who is a postdoc here at the LSC, talking about what we call narrative entanglement. And we were looking at the speeches in the European Parliament to look for this evidence of these trade offs. And indeed, what we found is that you see those two positions completely associated. The position that climate policy will create jobs, and the position that climate policy is necessary to fight climate change. And those two things don't need to be going together. I mean, you could perfectly well have the position climate policy is needed, and in particular, let's just say ETS and CBAM, the price based policies, those are essential, in my opinion, and at the same time, believe that some of these things have costs. And I think that people have, I think it has to do with social media that we have tended to have this simplified view of the world where everything has to be black and white and everybody has to be in one corner or the other. And everybody's kind of listening to you. Probably some of our listeners are now listening to try to figure out, is this guy some fascist? And other listeners are probably going to try to think, oh, is he some green ideologue? And the truth of the matter is people find it difficult to think, hey, let's think carefully through the arguments and let's see which ones make sense and which ones don't on the basis of the simple basis of a cost-benefit analysis, where the benefits include, of course, fighting global warming, and the costs include, of course, people not being able to pay their electricity bills. And let's try to take it all in and go little by little through all the policies. And that's been my position. And in this world, in the social media world of quick takes, it's hard to have this position.
Which is interesting, exactly. And even for someone like you, it sounds difficult, even given your track record of having worked, for example, on CBAM and the other policies, to say climate change is going to have costs and climate policy is going to have some costs too. Like, do you feel like this has been evolving where there's like less room for this type of debate? Because this is something that I did wonder, like you say, when they come out with these policies and sounds, and we're going to have great growth, and at the same time we're going to do climate policy. Like there's almost no room for, hey, there's trade-offs.
Yeah, I mean, once you put these targets on the table, so the way the European Union policy works is by setting up these targets. And then everything is measured against achieving these targets or not. Oh, you're withdrawing from targets. Oh, you're progressing to targets. And the cost benefit is completely forgotten from that point onwards. And yes, in my view, it's been harder to argue like this. And it's not only in this policy. I mean, almost all policies, trade, um, the fiscal policies in Europe or migration policies, almost all policies are simplified in this narratively entangled way, in which you have to take the position they are good, 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 good on all dimensions, or the other people take the position they are bad, bad, bad on like all the dimensions. And there is no reason things have to be correlated in that way. I understand that public discourse in politics has to be simplified to some extent, but when we're talking in the podcast, when we're writing a blog, when we're communicating our views honestly to people who want really to think through things, it has to be possible to put the cost and the benefits and to say, in my view, my own position is, I find the price based policies that we have been putting in place extremely beneficial and extremely useful. ETS and CBAM, the emission trading scheme and the carbon border adjustment mechanism. We need to do better with the CBAM, obviously. At the same time, as I find a lot of the quantity policies and a lot of the mandates very, very dangerous in many ways, not least in causing enormous misgivings to our citizens and for very, very little gains, like all of the policies in Germany for the heat pumps or the policies in France that make it impossible for an old lady to rent her house because the house is poor all her savings on, because it's what the French call logement G, it's category G, which means it's not well isolated. And if you don't isolate it well, you're not going to be insulated against heat loss. You're not going to be able to rent it. And that means you're sitting on an asset which is worth nothing, even though you put all your savings. And maybe that's just not a good policy, for example.
Which brings us to a point which my advisor Michael Green sometimes said is, once you've got the EU ETS or CBAM, to some extent you've priced the externality, you've priced the social cost of carbon, then you can kind of get rid of the other things because you've priced the externality.
I
But
think
then,
that's the thing that people don't understand. They want to turn this into some complex, set of rules, and which sometimes signal virtue but don't really achieve much in terms of the climate, the climate objective. How much are you going to manage to get with this new rule? And the truth is, if you price the externality, the consumption of carbon is the optimal one, and the innovation will happen, and the climate change will be stopped, and you don't need to get into people's lives and tell them what they need to do. I mean, I think that it's very damaging to be telling people, "Oh, you cannot take a holiday in Mallorca." If you're in England, Mallorca, one of the Balearic Islands, for those listeners in the US, is a classic place to go. You take a cheap flight and you go there. And people who are traveling to big conferences around the globe on big planes are telling the everyday citizens that they cannot go on the holidays anymore. And people are like, no, of course I want to go on my holiday. And the answer has to be, yeah, it's going to have to be a bit more expensive. It's today, but of course you can take as many holidays as you want. That's just fine. We should move away from a mentality of hectoring people to a mentality of possibility of more energy is better, not less energy. Let's use the renewables. Let's use nuclear. More abundance is better. We don't need to be feeling guilty about using air conditioning. Of course, you need to use air conditioning in summer. If you're in Madrid, you don't use it, you cannot have a life. So yes, use it, and let's have more energy, not less. Let's make it cleaner by having these prices. All of this discourse is all kind of gone in a direction that makes citizens not support the policy that is necessary.
so, and I hear two things. First is, I think sometimes, like you said, because we have quantity targets in Europe, there's no discussion of the social cost of carbon. Like, there are challenges with that. In the US, Trump had it, reduced it heavily, but then you had Biden. But here in Europe, we have quantity targets. So even now on LinkedIn, when I see the discourse, anytime something is proposed, it's like an immediate, oh, you're going back on what we have, agreed upon. It's like the cost benefit seems gone to some extent.
It does. It does. I mean, there is the target for climate neutrality, the climate for 2035, the target. There are all these targets, and all the discussion. Even I'm an economist. I was recently in a conference in Brussels, but all the discussion was like, "Oh, does this mean Europe is going back in the?" It's like, no, that's not the question. The question is not whether we're going back or not. The question is whether this is a good policy or not a good policy. And if it's not a good policy, just get rid of it, and don't be thinking about some made-up target that you just kind of agreed upon. Just and stick around, even when it maybe doesn't make sense once other things are happening. The truth of the matter is, we are very lucky. I mean, the way um, these climate objectives are going to be attained is through innovation. And the truth is, innovation is advancing beyond our best expectations. If you look at how annual generation of solar and of wind has been growing, and particularly uh, the solar one, it's been much faster than the ramp up of many energies, including nuclear. The diffusion is fantastic. We just need the batteries to complement that, and we'll be basically there. And I think because of all these shocks we're getting with the war in Ukraine and the war in Iran, people are really very conscious that we need to make those transitions, and innovation, I think, is going to happen. So, in a way, if we get the prices right and we don't lose the goodwill of the citizens, we're going to get there.
Has anything shifted in your thinking recently with the war in Iran, like because now we were getting these super high energy prices, and I think it makes you know people conscious that well, real higher energy prices do really hurt people. Like it really affects. Now every government is thinking about some additional support for their citizens. I mean,
Yeah,
the
I think
shocks.
the main reaction I have is that it's very depressing that in spite of what happened during the previous crisis, where citizens were subsidized left and right, we get these gigantic subsidies for carbon consumption. I mean, basically, in Spain, for example, they've given very very significant subsidies for people driving when we are supposed to be penalizing energy consumption, fossil fuel energy, and when the lowest 20% of the population, the poorest 20% of the population, doesn't drive or drives rarely. So you're basically having something that is unequal. You're helping the people who drive the big SUVs and very costly and not targeted and against climate. So it's we're not learning much from the Ukraine crisis. We should be thinking twice. But yeah, the other side is we all realize that um, we need to make the energy transition. That we need to stop our dependence on fossil fuels. I mean, Trump is tweeting today as we speak that he wants to drop the Hormuz protection as part of the U.S. mission, and that's for the Europeans to do. And we don't want to do it. Too bad for us. And and we need to do the transition. And also true, as you said, that it reminds us how much energy matters for everything from farmers to citizens of every kind. So that we need to do the policies well. For me, the key word that is missing in the European debate that is making some space in the US is abundance, energy abundance. All the European mindset is about it's kind of very Calvinistic on economizing, on punishing each other, punishing ourselves, on how bad we are, that we're polluting and everything. Truth of the matter is, as Helen Richie says in her book, Not the End of the World, she basically is a green person writing, look, this catastrophism, which is another of the principles in my list, avoid the catastrophism. We are on our way. We're going to win this fight. And the societies that get richer, like ours, like European societies, are societies that get cleaner, that protect more their ecosystem, that protect more the climate. And we have decoupled marvelously economic growth from emissions, so we can grow without making ourselves more dirty. So let's not look for the growth. Let's look for energy abundance, which means more solar, more wind, and more nuclear.
And what then? Because I agree, and I think it's a really good book. I also really recommend that one. You have laid out some principles, and we've talked about the fact that it's become like a little bit more black and white. Where do you see the biggest barrier then to going towards using more of these principles?
It's interesting in Europe. Okay, let me tell you in Europe, and we can talk about the US, but the US is just a different world right now. But let me tell you about Europe. Europe has a coalition governance, which is basically the Popular Party, center right, center left, center, and Greens, which form a majority that passes the legislation. We don't have an alternance between left and right, basically. That majority is the one that has governed Europe since the start. That means that when this majority goes off a cliff or goes too hard in one direction, the same people who pass some laws have to rectify and pass others. So Ursula von der Leyen has realized that she made some major mistakes in her previous mandate. She is the president of the Commission who has to undo these mistakes. The people in the ENVI committee in the European Parliament who have to rectify the legislation that they passed are the people who wrote this legislation and who feel very proud of it, every single piece of it, Much of it is useless. Much of it is terrible. You have to trace back every coffee bean and every cocoa bean to whatever farm, to where there was any deforestation in the farm where it came from in 2020. Well, it turns out you cannot know if some farm in Ghana had tree cover in 2020, and you cannot know if that particular bean came from this farm. And it's really crazy legislation that was just dreamed up by some bureaucrat and passed without really thinking. So the persons who passed this now so absolutely ecstatic about how great they were to pass it, have to now go and change it. Well, they won't. So as
Are
we
you talking
said,
about the CBAM now, or?
no. I was talking about the forestry regulation.
Okay, yeah, okay, sorry, yeah.
So, I mean, there were several kind of large pieces of legislation that were passed. The main ones were the European Climate Law, the Market Stability Reserve, the emission trading standards for vans and cars that stopped all emissions at 2035. No new cars can have internal combustion engine. The Social Climate Fund, the reform of the ETS, with the ETS2 for buildings and for trucks, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, the deforestation regulation that I was talking about, the renewable energy directive, the natural restoration law. All of those things were passed. Some of them had to do with climate. Some of them were part of a much more expansive agenda that didn't have anything to do with climate. Some of them were about mandates that again involve much higher cost of carbon. All of them are the achievements of some individual commissioners, some individual services of the commission, some individual members of parliament who are very proud of it, and it's very hard to rectify. Also, there's a strong bias towards more legislation in Europe. I mean, the parliament and the commission and the council don't have a budget. There is no budget in Europe. We're operating with national budgets and European rules. So the only way you make your mark as a member of parliament is if you pass more rules. And that's kind of something that has an inherent bias to more legislation rather than being careful and not passing rules. Yeah?
I was thinking that too because, as we discussed, in an ideal world, you have the EU ETS, you have the EU ETS 2, we set the price, we have the carbon border adjustment mechanism, and then all mandates could kind of be reduced. But I could imagine that as a politician, you have to somehow say that you've made things better. I have passed regulation X
Yeah, it's very
versus
hard to
you
have
have.
kind of as a bigger achievement that you told the voters in re-election and that you put on your website that you push regulation X, and then have as a bigger next achievement of the next mandate that you kill regulation X, right? That's kind of which is what Ursula von der Leyen is basically trying to do, but she's not directly elected by citizens. But she's now her claim to fame is that she's dismantling the things that she put in place. So yeah, it's very hard to do that.
How did you then maybe we can get into some of your story in politics then, because you were an academic first, and then I think you started getting. How did you then start getting into politics?
So it's very interesting. It started with the economic crisis. So many of the economists of the 50s and 60s doctors they started politics in with the Great Depression. Started economics with the Great Depression. I got interested in politics with the great financial crisis. It affected Spain very directly. We lost a lot of growth. It was clear that our growth model was not working based on building and very extensive and very little productivity and innovation. So I wrote a blog which was called Nada es Gratis, No Free Lunch, with a few other US based professors like I was at the time. We started writing these things and we got quite a bit of impact, and I got more involved in policy. I then joined a party in Spain, and there was a center party. They asked me to write a program for them, basically a reform oriented program on trying to get Spain on the innovation path and education. It was Denmark versus Venezuela. I was arguing Denmark. That was Spain's dilemma. We should go the path of Denmark and not let ourselves be carried towards Venezuela.
Okay.
And we we succeeded with this party. It went very well. We got quite a few seats in the national parliament. Then I was suggested to me to run by the boss of the party, Albert Rivera, to run for the European elections as the head of the list. And in Europe we have lists, so you vote for the whole list, and we got 9 seats in parliament. I was the head of this parliamentary group, and then we joined with Renew Europe, with the French, with Macron, and with the Dutch liberals and the Swedish liberals and so on, and in a group that was called Renew Europe. And I got actually involved not in just policy and writing pieces, which is what I did at the start when I wrote the program for the party, but actually visiting voters everywhere in Spain, explaining them Europe, being in TV all the time, in the radio, explaining Europe, explaining legislation, actually also seeking votes, doing campaigning. And it was a really unusual experience for an economist, for sure.
Yeah. What stood out to you the most? Like, what had you not expected from this experience?
I think that we tend to think that policy is a matter of optimizing some welfare function, and yeah, maybe some political groups have more weight in that policy function that they should have. We maybe forget some of the things. I think we forget two things that are really, really important: is the gigantic importance of process, and the role that implementation plays, and the role of staff. Staff is extremely important. The European Parliament, the accredited parliamentary assistants and group advisors are the ones who draft and negotiate a lot of the legislation. Many politicians don't have much interest in actual policy. You'd be surprised to know they kind of get briefed by the staff in the last minute, and they just say whatever is in there. They kind of give the general directions, of course, and they hire a staff that is consistent with the party position. So, in that sense, they are delegating, and that's probably fine. But what I'm trying to say is, staff plays a huge role. On process, I don't think people and implementation. I don't think people are mindful of how many steps there are from having a good idea and even having that idea passed as a law to that idea making a difference. I remember hearing Jennifer Palka in a Ezra Klein podcast explain, and people, your listeners, if they have the time, they should listen to this podcast, where she explains the website of Obamacare. She also wrote a book about it and how impossible it was because the politicians had imposed all these requirements, and it was impossible to do a website that would actually satisfy all these requirements in the time they were given. So it was touch and go for the whole Obamacare program to fail.
Yeah.
It didn't manage. And this happens much more than you think. That you talk to the government and they say, yeah, we're happy to set in place this employment training program that you want to set up. And you talk to the civil servants, and it seems like everybody wants to do it. And then you start trying to do it, and there are all these obstacles all over the place that you haven't really thought about, because they have to do with the nitty-gritty details matters, and process matters a lot. So I think that, of course, in the European Union, those two things are particularly important, because the European Union policymaking is particularly remote for both voters. There's no such a thing as a European public opinion. There's Spanish public opinion, German public opinion. But I cannot talk as a European politician to European voters. I write in Politico in the Financial Times, but how many voters really
Yeah.
those two Europe-wide media? Maybe I can put an article in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung and in Le Monde. But again, I'm not going to really change the way Europeans experience this.
And
Yeah, no.
when you, yeah, go ahead.
The absence of a public opinion indeed means that it's very hard to hold accountable some
Yeah.
of the staff and civil servants and bureaucrats in doing these decisions, and also the politicians. It's not just the staff, which very often is very highly minded and is trying to do the right thing.
There was also a Belgian economist, Paul de Grauwe, who also went into politics. And he said, yeah, he was just surprised just by how long these things took and how many steps there were needed. And he wanted to make change, but it wasn't happening very fast. So I feel like you said, the process, the implementation. Then on the EU level, you also helped shape the initial carbon border adjustment mechanism legislation. So
yeah, no, I am quite satisfied with how much progress I managed to do. If anything, the parliament was too successful in passing laws. We were rapid. There was a consensus among countries. There was consensus among parliamentarians that the climate change had to be addressed. And we passed quite a few pieces of legislation. As I argued, some of them were maybe not ideal because of this bias towards producing more law that I was arguing, and because sometimes the laws get produced at 4 o'clock in the morning in the trilogues.
yeah,
But I am pretty happy. I mean, I pushed. I mean, I think the 3 or 4 things that I did relating climate. I produced the first initiative report on the climate and the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is basically a way to make sure that countries that don't have carbon pricing have to pay carbon pricing in order to enter the European market, so that you don't disadvantage the European producers. Of course, the problem with that is that it has to be comprehensive, so you don't get substitution between, let's say,
Yeah.
aluminum and steel. You tax aluminum but not steel. You need to have both. But also vertical, right? If you tax aluminum but you don't tax cars, then people won't make the cars in Europe and they will just import the cars. So you need to design this well. And I was very aware of these trade-offs, and I tried to make a proposal that was taking them into account. But of course, you have to also think of implementations. I was saying, oh, if you include everything, it's going to be a complicated system. So the system at the end is not quite ideal in that way. But I think that I mean, the work that we did on CBAM and on studying at ETS, I think the extension of ETS was a good thing.
And
And I think that, yeah, I'm quite
yeah.
happy with the work there. I worked a lot on Ukraine sanctions and trying to sanction Russia and Ukraine invasion sanctions to Russia. And
Did you get a sense there was openness to the cost benefit? Did you sense there was an openness to the cost benefit analysis? So you argue for these principles. So while you were in policy, I imagine you also advocated for them. Like, was there openness to it while you were?
no, there's not a lot of openness, and that's why I wrote this paper on narrative entanglement with Alan Brzezinski, where we basically identified we have 47,000 speeches from the European Parliament, and all of them basically during one term. And we identify this tendency of the speeches to conflate all the arguments, to see the world in black or in white and not to see trade-offs. So my sense is that the reason is voters are not going to get into the subtleties of things. Voters want to basically hear a coherent, simple thing. And if they hear like the complex discussion we're having, you and me now, they're going to get confused. Is this good? Is this bad? We're trying to get the listeners and ourselves to think hard about what should be taken into account. And that's necessarily nuanced. And when you make a speech to voters, you often kind of lose, or you see politicians lose all that nuance, and that's reflected in legislation often.
And so we're talking about speeches now. I've recently read some articles about like some hypothetical, you know, person in parliament didn't exactly gets these things. And like one of the points they were making is there's a disconnect between the speeches and then their like actual willingness to negotiate when they're at the table.
Yeah, it could be that you are signaling different things. I think in our data, the speeches seem quite related to the way the
Okay.
politicians vote, so they do seem to be quite
Yeah.
related. But we have all the speeches, and what you do see is that you could say, oh, necessarily so, but I mean, I remember hearing one of these big debates. I spent all 7 hours of the debate because I was curious. I was the initiator of whatever was being proposed, which I think was CBAM, and I heard all the speeches, and I noticed that there was only one person in all the speeches that I heard who really talked in terms of trade-offs, who really acknowledged, like, hey, this is going to be costly, but we need to do it.
So what made you then shift from policy again to academics? So in some sense, you're a top economist in policy. So I imagine your marginal added value was really big there. So
Yes, you could also say I'm somebody who knows very well politics in academia, so I'm
yeah,
marginal value
that's
added
true.
is high because I can tell people, like, hey, here's how you have impact. So the intersection, at any rate, is still part of my life. I'm trying to be at the intersection between those two things. I'm in the policy school at LSE. I'm teaching lots of students, a couple hundred students this year,
Yeah.
how to think of policy, how to influence the process, how to get things done. So in a way, I'm basically back to academia, but with all this experience,
Yeah.
explaining what I wish I had known when I started, and I hope that's useful for
Yeah.
students.
What would you, how would you then recommend to economists or students who are willing to say, hey, I agree with the principles, I'm trained, I like cost benefit analysis, to engage with more with the policy making, whether it be climate policy or something else?
I think you need to understand voters and to understand politicians a bit more deeply than we do. So I would say voters don't have the time to get into the weeds of a lot of these debates on trade, on immigration, on climate. And Brian Kaplan has a book on this, The Myth of the Rational Voter, where he says, look, the fact that the voter is rational, which has to be a starting point, means that, look, if it's puzzling in a certain way, why does the voter vote? Because his vote doesn't, or her vote doesn't make a big difference at the end of the day. But they vote because of an obligation, an identity, all these things. Then it's even more puzzling. Why would a voter study your policy proposal and figure out what you are arguing? At the end of the day, the voter doesn't have the time and doesn't have the expertise to judge it. So the voters are going to make their decisions based on the perception of the entire package. You know, there are all this research on how students evaluate us as teachers when we're teaching a class. And it turns out that the evaluations, the first 10 minutes of the class, is almost perfectly correlated with the evaluation of the entire 30 or 40 hours we've taught. The voters are a bit the same. They're going to make up their mind relatively fast. Politicians, on the other hand, you have to also understand what their incentives are. And politicians are very similar to how economists think of them. Political economy models get them quite right. Politicians want to be re-elected, and they want things that work, and they want things that appeal to voters. So sometimes we make proposals that are neither simplified or clear enough for voters, nor attractive enough for politicians. So I tell students about some proposals that we make in Spain, that we made in Spain. I was very much pushing a salary complement for poorer people, which was basically based on the earned income tax credit in the US, which was a negative tax that gives you some money and basically you declare your taxes and it gives you back more money than you have paid. So it's a transfer from the state, but happens with your taxes. I don't think I managed to explain this. You know, if I had said the state is going to give $100 per citizens, that everybody understands that and they can decide. But a negative income tax was very difficult to explain. So I think that you need to think, and that's the class I teach at LSC, of the economic policy very carefully. The cost benefit has to be the start of everything. And you have to propose good policy and policy that makes sense from cost benefit analysis. Second, you have to think of the political economy. Where are the interest groups aligned? How do the politicians see it? How are the unions going to see it? Who are the other interest groups? If the political economy doesn't work, you might as well have the best idea in the world. You're going to have to go back to the drawing board. Third, you're going to have to think of the narratives. Can you explain your policy? Can you tell it in a way that voters will be able to grasp it and understand what you're arguing? And fourth, you will have to think of implementation. So you will have to think of, is this a policy that actually we have the state capacity to do? We have the civil servants who want to do it. The incentive for the civil servants will be to put it in place, or the whole system will collapse under the weight of the policy. So, for example, if you put a policy to give subsidies that requires everybody to write a memo explaining how the subsidy is going to be used and then expose the right justification, then you're going to be inundated with memos and the policy is not going to succeed at actually giving the subsidy. Maybe you want to put it as part of the income tax so that people get a deduction when they make the expense that you want them to make in innovation or R&D or whatever it is. So thinking of implementation might change your mind about what is the right policy, always starting from the cost benefit, but thinking of the political economy, of the narrative, and of the implementation as well.
Awesome. I think that was really good. I really appreciated that. I think it will also be very good for me to keep in mind when I think of these things. So we've covered a lot. We've covered the energy policy. I think we've also covered some of your career. There's, I mean, a million more questions I would like to ask you, but also be respectful. Is there anything you feel like we haven't really quite covered on the EU energy climate policy front? Something else you want to say?
No, I mean, I think my main thought here is that to the politicians and to the people who want the climate agenda to succeed in the world, innovation is the priority. Innovation is the only way that we're going to get China and India and etc. to reduce their emissions. So we need to turn Europe into an innovative powerhouse, not just in AI, not just in information technology, not just in all these areas where Europe is behind, but also in climate. And in order to do that, we need to facilitate, reduce regulation, facilitate people starting businesses, facilitating people exiting, facilitating people growing their businesses, and get a single market right. So innovation first should be the name of the game across the board, in my view.
And I agree with that because I think it's also a point, like you say, we only produce 6% of global emissions in the EU, whereas innovation that can scale
Exactly.
that can scale globally. Versus
Exactly.
if we go to net zero, which we should at some way or another, but then the innovation is what's going to drive the faster transition, and then also scale up to China, India, where the emissions really are intense. So I thought that was also a really good
Exactly.
point. So
Exactly.
then, Luis, thank you so much for taking the time. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. It was a great conversation. Appreciate it.